Welcome to this webinar by the Canadian Industrial Relations Association. I'm Lorenzo Frangi. I'm a professor of Industrial Relations at the University of Quebec in Montréal. Bienvenue à tout le monde à cet webinaire de l'Association canadienne des relations industrielles. Je suis Lorenzo Frangi, je suis professeur en relations du travail à l'UQAM, à l'École des sciences de la gestion de l'UQAM. So, just maybe a quick presentation for people who are not familiar with the CIRA. So the Canadian Industrial Relations Association is an association of mainly scholars, but also practitioners, as well as any other people who is interested in debating work and employment dynamics in Canada and beyond. We have members from Canada, as well as we have members from all over the world. L'Association canadienne des relations industrielles, c'est une association canadienne qui va regrouper notamment des académiciens, mais aussi des praticiens, aussi tous les gens qui sont intéressés à débattre des dynamiques du travail et de l'emploi. Pour la plupart, on est des personnes qui viennent du Canada, mais il y a des personnes qui viennent aussi de toutes les parties du monde. So this webinar is going to be bilingual, and I really thank Valérie and Solène for having prepared bilingual slides to facilitate the communication. And ce webinaire va être bilingue grâce aussi au fait que Valérie et Solène ont préparé des slides dans les deux langues, et je vous remercie vraiment beaucoup pour ça. Juste avant de commencer, pour vous dire, l'ACRI, ça fait depuis plusieurs années qu'organise des webinaires sur les différentes dynamiques du travail et de l'emploi. CIRA is organizing webinars since many years around work and employment dynamics. And in the last couple of years, we are focusing on equality, diversity and inclusion. And dans les deux dernières années, on se focalise vraiment sur les dynamiques de l'inclusion et de la diversité et de l'égalité. Aujourd'hui, on a le plaisir d'avoir avec nous Valérie Martin et Solène Métayer, qui vont nous parler notamment des travailleuses et travailleurs en situation de handicap. Today, we have the major pleasure to have here with us Valérie Martin and Solène Métayer, who are going to speak about workers with disabilities and how there is an overlap between the disability and the world of work. So just a few technical questions for people who are attending. First of all, please keep your mic off. There are right now 59 people who are connected, and that means that it's a very interesting topic we are discussing. And if you have any question, you can write to the chat either to everyone or directly to the presenters. The presenter will present for around 35 minutes. After this, we will have a moment for Q&A. As mentioned, maybe it's easier if all of you, if you have questions, you write in the chat, and then the two presenters will answer, maybe to taking together 2-3 questions that have been addressed to them. So without any further ado, I would ask Valérie and Solène to start the presentation. But first, allow me first of all to thank them. Merci bien Valérie, merci bien Solène pour être avec nous et pour nous permettre de connaître mieux cette thématique vraiment importante. Just a mot, Valérie Martin is a professor of management and occupational health and safety at the business school of UQAM, and she focuses on inclusive business for people with disabilities, especially autism. Solène is a human resource professional who works in different fields, and interesting enough, she learned at the age of 32 that she was affected by autism, though with a high intellectual potential, and she's now starting a Ph.D. in communication at UQAM. Technically, we should, Jonathan, can you please? Thank you, Jonathan. So, Valérie, you can start to share your...
Okay, I'll try if this works.
Should work. It seems to work perfectly. Yes, just put presentation mode.
Yeah.
Perfect,
so,
it works.
There you go. Donc, merci beaucoup à l'Association canadienne des relations industrielles. Merci aussi Solène, c'est la première fois qu'on collabore comme ça pour une conférence. Donc, on a travaillé pour cette présentation-ci. So the outline of my presentation will be to talk about who are Canadians with disability, and we'll speak a little bit more about autism and neurodivergence. We'll talk about discrimination, but as well how to negotiate accommodation. I'll discuss universal accessibility because it's really an interest of mine, and how employment comes into an ecosystemic approach. I see a lot of francophones here. I'll try to introduce bits of French in my talk, but I know as well people that are highly experienced in that field. So I hope I'll still be able to say something new and interesting for you. So who are Canadians with disability? So when you look at working age adult, 25 to 64, 20% or more has one or more disabilities. So those are the data of the Canadian Survey of Disability from 2017. So this survey is done every 5 years. And the prevalence of disability will increase with age. So being 30% when you're 15 to 24 to 38% if we look at 65 and older. So when we look at our workforce and our aging workforce, we need to take into account that the older our workforce is, the more susceptible they are to experience disability. It's more prevalent for women than men, maybe because they report it more. And when you look at the younger demographic, health-related disability is the most common disability that is reported. Not everyone might be knowledgeable about all types of disability. So of course, everyone know about sensory disability, seeing or hearing, or mobility disability, but flexibility disability is being able to bend down or reach for object. Dexterity is being able to use tool. Pain-related disability is as well important. So if you experience chronic pain, you might have a lot of limitation in what you can do in your daily life. Mental health related disability is as well part of disability that are reported, and cognitive disability include learning disabilities such as dyslexia, memory, or developmental disabilities such as disability arising from attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity. Regarding the dynamic of disability, we might be used to thinking about disability as something continuous, so persistent or unchanging, or we might know more about progressive limitation, but there are as well episodic limitations. So you have a certain period of time where you experience limitation, and then after that you have another period of time without limitation. So multiple sclerosis might be an example of that. So at some point you might have experienced fatigue, weakness, blurred vision, and it may last for a couple of months, and then you have remission for a longer time. Fluctuating limitation is when you have a limitation that is continuous, but the intensity varies with time. So you might think about someone having chronic migraines. So at some point they might have important migraines and their activities are very limited. At the other time, they don't have migraines, but they might be aware of possible triggers of migraines and need to limit their activities in order to prevent other migraines. Finally, other type of descriptive of disability is visible or invisible. A visible disability is something that anyone can readily see. Invisible disability might be totally invisible because the individual is able to mask, or it might become only visible when you interact with the person, but you might attribute to other cause the limitation that you see. You might see it as a lack of motivation, incompetence, or maybe personality. So masking a disability might come at an important cost for the person. We might think as well about the cause of the disability. It can be congenital, so someone is born with this disability. It can be acquired as a result of an injury and an illness. And on the workplace, it might make a difference if the onset is before your working life or during your tenure in a job. And finally, it can be related to an occupational injury or illness. And in the Canadian Survey of Disability, a quarter of people reported that they thought that the underlying cause of their disability was related to the workplace. Men were more susceptible than women to report this. I like to use this model when I think about disability and my work. So it's the Human Development Model and Disability Creation Process by Fougerolas. It is a model that is quite used in Quebec and including in different policies. So it's the idea that situations are disabling. So an individual with his different capabilities will be in interaction with his environment, and the environment might be macro-societal, so attitude of the society, policy. It might be meso at the community level, let's say the workplace policies, or it can be micro in the direct environment of the individual, so the relationship with his supervisor. And this environment might be physical or social. And this interaction between the individual factors and the environmental factors will create the disabling situation or a social participation situation, depending on the daily activities and the social roles. So an example, if I think about a city councillor in Montreal that uses a wheelchair, when she went to Toronto to do her Ph.D, she experienced much less disabling situation in transportation, because public transport in Toronto are more accessible for a wheelchair user. When she came back to live in Montreal, she experienced much more disabling situation in transportation because Montreal public transportation is much less accessible. So the same individual, the same activities, but the disability situation was much more important in one setting than in another one, for physical factor, but as well social factors, meaning what we believe is necessary in our public transportation and who should access our public transportation. So I'll...
Yeah, thanks.
Tout seul.
Thank you. Lorenzo l'a dit tout à l'heure, je suis autiste et j'ai longtemps dit que j'étais en situation de handicap dans le même type de ce que Valérie vient de dire. Donc, c'était l'environnement qui devait s'adapter à moi. J'ai des hypersensibilités, donc l'environnement devait tenir compte de mes sensibilités, devait tenir compte de mes limites et s'adapter à moi. Mais je me suis vite rendu compte, en fait, que ça ne convenait pas, que ce n'était pas la représentation de ma réalité. En fait, j'ai aussi des limitations, même quand je suis chez moi, toute seule dans un environnement qui est adapté à moi. Et j'ai des limites, notamment par rapport à ma fatigabilité. Donc, il y a des limites à ce que je peux faire. Et ces limites-là, donc, sont propres à ma personne. Et c'est là qu'intervient le modèle de socio-subjectif qui est notamment développé par Alexandre Barry de l'Université d'Ottawa. Donc, ce modèle-là veut qu'il y ait à la fois le côté social, donc environnemental, qui est à jouer, qui joue, et puis aussi le fait de la personne. Donc, la personne aussi a des limitations qui sont propres à elle et que l'environnement ne peut pas corriger. À toi, Valérie.
Merci. So that's why I like to work with Sudden, because she brings me new ideas and models that I don't know of. So if we talk more specifically about disability and work, the Canadian Survey of Disability shows that 59% of persons with disability are employed versus 80% without disability. 66% having mild disability and 31% having more severe disability. But when they looked at, so we can see that there are a discrimination here, and they try to estimate the number of people that could be potential worker when looking at people neither in education, neither in employment. And they calculated that 645,000 people had the potential to work and were excluded from the workplace. So I'm really curious to see what will be the numbers in the 2022 survey after the pandemics and the more accessibility of homework or telework, distance work, and with the labor shortage, maybe that will open the minds of employers to be less biased and do discrimination in employment. So what is discrimination? Is being refused or restricted access to a job interview, to being hired, to different opportunities in the workplace. If you don't have strong social ties with others, maybe you might not get the information that you need in order to get possible assignment or perform better in some work assignment. Is being restricted in the resources that you can get or the rewards that you can get. Is not having a fair evaluation of your performance. So we know that performance evaluation can be biased because but sometimes as well is not having access to a truthful feedback. So some people might think that it's not nice to critique an individual with disability and not give them feedback that would help them improve and grow in their job. Is as well not having access to promotion. And you have a very interesting study by Dan Samouche, a Canadian researcher, that showed that there were glass partition, glass ceiling, or glass cliff for people with disability in their workplace. And finally, not having access to a salary increase. Is as well being isolated in the workplace. On the other hand, inclusion might mean being accepted and treated as an esteemed member of the work group, is having strong social ties with others without having to hide your disability. So you're there and appreciated for yourself and not having to mask.
À mon tour, donc je voulais vous parler de 3 situations qui illustrent ce que vient de dire Valérie, qui me sont arrivées dans ma vie professionnelle. Donc, il y a eu une première période où je travaillais dans le réseau de la santé et je n'avais jamais de promotion malgré mes demandes répétées pour en avoir une. Et j'ai fini par comprendre, en fait, que c'était probablement parce que je dis les choses trop directement. Je manque un peu de tact, malheureusement, à cause de mon autisme. Je dis les choses telles que je les pense. Et ça ne convenait pas forcément dans le milieu dans lequel j'étais, où on voulait vraiment qu'on suive ce que la direction disait. Et moi, au contraire, je posais des questions, je disais ma pensée et c'était peut-être moins bien vu. Et donc, ce n'était pas ce qui était attendu d'une personne qui aurait eu une promotion. Donc, je n'en ai pas eu. Et ça, bien, vu que c'était dû à ma situation de handicap, à ma situation d'autisme, mais en fait, c'est de la discrimination. Ensuite, il y a eu une période où j'étais incluse. Donc, j'avais un emploi où on m'offrait le télétravail, où on m'offrait un horaire flexible, où j'avais un travail à temps partiel également. Et ça, ce n'était pas offert juste à moi. Donc, je ne ressortais pas du lot. C'était offert à tout le monde dans mon entreprise. Bref, j'étais incluse parce que je n'avais pas à mettre de l'avant le fait que j'étais autiste et que j'avais besoin de ces situations-là. J'avais besoin de ces mesures adaptatives-là, mais en fait, j'avais juste à les demander puisque c'était offert à tout le monde. Donc, j'étais une parmi tant d'autres au sein de l'organisation et c'était donc une situation d'inclusion. Et finalement, il y a eu un emploi où j'étais exclue et c'était assez subtil et c'était surtout ça partait de bonnes intentions. Donc, en fait, c'est que je suis donc autiste, j'ai de la difficulté avec les relations sociales et bref, on m'a évité de rencontrer des clients trop souvent. Je n'avais pas de lien avec les clients, donc je n'avais pas de lien avec d'autres interactions sociales qui auraient pu être difficiles pour moi. Donc, ça partait d'une bonne intention. On voulait m'éviter de me mettre dans une situation où je n'étais pas à mon aise. Par contre, l'inconvénient, c'est qu'on avait besoin de ces liens-là avec les clients pour faire partie de l'équipe, parce que tout le monde faisait des liens avec les clients. Ensuite, parce que je n'avais pas les projets les plus intéressants, puisque les projets les plus intéressants étaient donc avec des clients. Bref, j'étais tranquillement exclue de l'équipe, puisque j'étais la seule à ne pas faire cette tâche-là. Et donc, ça pouvait me mener aussi à une situation où est-ce que je n'avais pas de promotion et je n'avais pas de projet intéressant puisque j'étais celle qui ne touchait pas à la clientèle et qui ne faisait pas ces tâches-là. Mais à la base, c'était vraiment pour une bonne raison, ce qui était de me faire du bien, mais ça pouvait me mener dans une situation où j'étais exclue finalement.
Selene, I'll try to do a quick translation because
Okay,
that was
good
too
luck.
interesting to, to not
Good
translate and make sure that everyone understands. So discrimination, you said that in one of your jobs, you didn't get a promotion and you believe that it's because you were too direct with people, so they thought that it was not, you did not have the tact or the social capacities to be able to manage different people, and it would be different. You give an example of inclusion. So in one of your workplace, you could work from home and work part-time, but this was the same thing as anyone in your team that could get access. So you were not different than anyone. You had the same working condition and you could use the same workplace policies. So you were really included and member of the team. And the exclusion is that they assume that you did not want to participate in meeting with clients because you're maybe not always at ease with social communication. So it came from a good intention, but then again, it was hard for you to get more interesting mandate because being in contact with the clients gave access to more interesting assignments, and it prevented you to have a professional development again, because having link with clients was important to that. Yeah. Est-ce que j'ai manqué certains éléments?
Non, c'était mieux dit qu'avec moi-même. Merci Valérie.
So what are accommodations? So at the basic, accommodation is a legal obligation based on the charters of rights and freedom in Canada. Is the duty to accommodate the needs of people with disability when they are affected by negatively affected by a requirement, a rule, or a standard. So the organization have the duty to accommodate in unless they can prove that it's going to be undue hardship for the organization, but they really need to be creative. It's an individualized process that starts with the disclosure. So it might be a big decision to a worker to disclose his health condition because you will be open up to discrimination in the workplace and losing maybe access. It's sharing personal information that you might otherwise want to keep personal. So sometimes accommodation and adaptation are used in the same manners, but I would add that adaptation might be not a legal obligation, but a managerial decision. So a manager could decide without going through this legal process to provide different adaptation in the workplace to either meet the need of one individual or the collective individual. And we know that accommodation work because from a study from Chandala and Rouxel, that's from the UK, they followed a group of workers over time, some with impairment, some without impairment. And they saw that worker with impairment who reported having work accommodation had an increased chance to remain in employment than their peers with impairment that did not get any work accommodation. In addition, they found that people without impairment also got work accommodation, and the most cited reason for that was caregiving responsibility. So we can see that adaptation might be needed for many different people in your organization to make sure that it can continue to be in employment. Again, with the Canadian survey on disability, 37% of employees with disability reported needing at least one workplace accommodation. And the most popular one were flexible work arrangement, workstation modification, or human or technical support. 75% of those said they need were met, but only 36% when they said they needed 3 or more accommodations. So probably the people having more disabilities. Negotiating an accommodation or an adaptation, it's not something easy. It's not filling out a form and then boom, you get the accommodation you want. It's really a process. And this is from a Canadian study from Osen and all, very interesting, that try to unpack how accommodation are negotiated in a workplace. And they really saw it was an iterative, nonlinear, and interactive process that came across that was done over multiple conversation. It was influenced by social, relational, and political factors. So sometimes you had factors other than only the disability of the people and the workplace duties that were considered in that. And another important element was that the social capital of the individual with the disability was an important factor as well. So individuals that were higher up in the hierarchy had were more susceptible of getting an accommodation than people in the lower place in the hierarchy. People full-time were more susceptible to get an accommodation than people part-time or people with permanent employment versus people with casual employment in an organization. So it's related more to the status of the worker than the need for accommodation or the nature of the disability. This conversation as well involved many stakeholders. So HR personnel, of course, the direct supervisor, the union member as well. And it's really important to see that the union member could have a role in supporting the individual during the accommodation negotiation, but sometimes they are at odds because they also have a role with all their members, union members. So sometimes having an accommodation mean waiving a provision of the collective agreement, such as a posting requirement or a seniority provision. So they were sometimes put in those conflicting roles, and they're less involved when it comes to new workers. So during the staffing process, the union are less involved in supporting individual in getting the accommodation that they need. Accommodation as well is something that evolves with time. So you might not get it right on the first time. You might need to try 1, 2, or 3 type of accommodation before getting the right fit. As well, accommodation might change if the individual changes with time, but as well if the workplace changes with time. We see that the environmental factor plays a role in disabling an individual. So if there a new product, new service, new software, new work process, new manager, all this might influence the need for adjusting accommodation that we're already providing or already working previously. So that's why instead of really always working in an individual fashion, I think we need to think more about collective accessibility and designing workplaces for accessibility from the onset. So using the universal design approach, the universal design is an approach that says that designing product and environments should be taught with the idea of being used by the largest population possible. And they see that disability and exclusion result from poor design. So if you design with only one type of ideal workers in mind, then you will be discriminating and restricting access to other people that were not fitting in your ideal worker mind, but still are part of your workforce. And I think universal design might really be an interesting point in negotiating collective agreements. So unions could really use this idea when thinking about all their members and their aging members to really think about possible adaptation that are readily available to everyone based on their needs, instead of having to accompany everyone that needs an individual accommodation. So what do I mean by workplace accommodation. So you really can think about a physical environment. How to create a more accessible workplace would be to do accessible facilities. So you have ramps, you have bathroom, you have automatic doors. So automatic doors are useful for a wheelchair user, but as well with people carrying a lot of boxes. Having alarms that use sound but light as well, might be vibration, having accessible parking close by to your workplace for people who need it. You can adjust a workstation as well. So being able to adjust light or noise might be useful for people suffering from migraines. Having adaptable furniture. So I'm 5 foot, so I always need adaptation wherever I go. Being able to have a phone with maybe larger numbers, an ergonomic keyboard. In your different workstation or work tool or machines, you could have alarms again that use sound, vibration, and light at the same time. Software are a big things in our jobs because there's software everywhere. And I don't know if you've noticed recently, but in the Microsoft product, you can do now accessibility audit, and they will go through your slide and show you where some slide are inaccessible. So do the software, the professional software that you use are accessible? So can you change the font? Can you have a speech a reading software add-on? Could you dictate information instead of typing? So those having an accessible software designed as such reduces the need afterward to provide an accommodation to someone who might need the software afterwards. So all those features, if they are readily available for everyone in your workspace, will normalize the use of assisting device and reduce the bias and discrimination. Social changes that you can also do in your workplace to make it more accessible to everyone. Of course, it's starting with attitude toward disability. So everyone will be more aware that different people have different needs for different reasons. You can also work on your work organization. As Céline said, is there a flexible schedule, the number of hours, the flexibility of hours, the work pace, can it be adjusted? Can you take breaks when you need them, or is it very difficult to take breaks? I hope that teleworking will continue to be in use even after the pandemics, because I think it makes for a very important change for many workers with disability. How well can you negotiate tasks and duties? Can you provide more routine or flexibility? Training is as well very important. So if you do an in-house training, is it accessible? If you ask an external providers, is there closed captioning? Is there, does the facility is accessible if someone need to go somewhere to have his training? So if you think accessibility in training, you create a training taking into account multiple needs. Communication as well, normalizing the idea that you need to adjust communication around different people, and then you can have it's more accessible. So I'm thinking about a plant that I visited, and they had a couple of I'm forgetting the word. Sourds, des employés qui étaient sourds. Deaf workers, yeah, I thought it is. So, and they were used to having sign language interpreters when they had big meetings or they had one-on-one meetings that on a delicate subject, and they did that as a normal way of managing their employee. And finally, normalizing having an external support to help you discuss with your employee, your employee. We're used to have a consultant for business matters. We can also have a consultant for accessible environment matters.
Et justement, ces professionnels-là qui sont plus de l'externe, qui sont des professionnels en accompagnement de la neuro-inclusion notamment, mais en fait, ils font plusieurs tâches. Il y a probablement avec la personne, donc la personne qui a des besoins, qui a des besoins d'accommodement potentiel, bien en fait, il y a de l'accompagnement pré-embauche, donc pré-emploi, donc tout ce qui touche la recherche d'emploi. Que ce soit pour le CV, pour la lettre d'intention, pour la recherche d'emploi sur les job boards. Donc, toutes ces actions-là qui sont potentiellement difficiles. Il y a pour l'entrevue, donc que ce soit de préparer à l'entrevue par rapport aux questions qui seront posées, notamment comment se présenter, comment agir, que ce soit, par exemple, d'accompagner la personne à l'entrevue pour traduire, entre guillemets, les questions sur le moment. Donc, il y a plusieurs possibilités de ce point de vue-là. Ça peut être d'aider au niveau de l'apprentissage de la tâche. Donc, par exemple, de séquencer la tâche, de la diviser en petits morceaux plus digestes, de mettre des pictogrammes, par exemple, aussi, peut être intéressant. Donc, d'adapter la tâche à l'individu, de revoir quelles parties de l'emploi pourraient être enlevées versus et remis. Donc, selon les forces de l'individu, bien sûr. Et tout ça en harmonie avec le gestionnaire, évidemment. Ça peut aider d'aider également avec les relations sociales, donc de donner des trucs, de traduire encore une fois ce qui s'est dit, ce que ça veut dire aussi, tout le non-verbal, par exemple. Valérie me donnait un exemple d'une situation où un gestionnaire reprochait à son employé de prendre trop de pauses, de toujours être en train de parler au travail. Et après une observation de l'accompagnant, en fait, on s'est rendu compte que les collègues, pour bien faire, venaient jaser et dire bonjour à l'employé. Puis lui, ce qu'il avait appris, c'était de s'arrêter, de porter attention à la personne et de discuter avec, de continuer la conversation, de relancer la conversation. Et pour lui, c'était ça qui était poli de faire, qu'il fallait faire. Mais pendant ce temps-là, évidemment, son travail ne se faisait pas. Donc, la solution à cette situation-là, ça a été simplement de dire aux collègues, évitez de venir le déranger pendant qu'il travaille et de dire à l'employé, en fait, tu peux simplement dire bonjour, puis retourner à ton travail ou indiquer que tu es en train de travailler, que tu as besoin de te concentrer. Donc, ça peut être aussi d'avoir une fiche à côté de ton bureau pour dire que tu as besoin de te concentrer. Donc, des situations comme ça un peu où tout le monde veut bien faire, mais qui peuvent être problématiques. Au final, ça peut être, c'est ça, de traduire et puis de donner des instructions à la personne. Donc, évidemment, de simplement lui dire de ne pas parler aurait été problématique puisqu'il aurait dit « ouais, mais c'est pas poli de ne pas parler ». Donc, en fait, c'est d'expliquer la situation comme ça. Ça peut être aussi avec l'employeur. Donc, il y a évidemment la sensibilisation à la situation de handicap, en l'occurrence la neuro-inclusion. Donc, d'expliquer quelles sont les manifestations, comment agir, etc. Ça peut être d'adapter aussi les processus de gestion, donc notamment les instructions doivent être généralement données verbalement, mais également par écrit. Donc, de doubler comme ça les interactions. Ça peut être de toutes les mesures adaptatives qu'on a vues tout à l'heure, donc le télétravail, l'horaire flexible, ce genre de mesures-là. Donc, ça peut être aidant pour la personne qui en a besoin. Et finalement, l'aide aux relations sociales, encore une fois, parce que si on pense à l'exemple que je donnais tout à l'heure, où moi, je disais les choses trop crûment, si mon gestionnaire avait su que c'était ma façon d'agir et que c'était pour bien faire, probablement que ça aurait été tout à fait différent. Donc, quelqu'un qui est spécialiste là-dedans, qui est accompagnant, un job coach, comme on dit en anglais, eh bien, en fait, ça va être une personne qui va accompagner tant l'individu que l'employeur dans ce cheminement-là vers l'emploi.
I'll try to translate quickly. So individual professional that help with the neuro inclusion, so individual neurodivergent individual can work either with the person or with the employer. So with the employer, they might raise awareness about what is autism, what is the need of individual with autism, but what are their force as well and capabilities, and they can work with the manager to adapt the way they supervise this individual and help with the social relation of the individual. So Solène said when she was fired, she couldn't get promoted because she was very direct. Maybe a talk about this would have changed the outcome. With the person, of course, you can help the person during the research for work, but as well maybe accompany them during the interview, because this is such a difficult process to be interviewed from a social interaction point of view. It's helping someone learning the task of his job, depending on what are their needs in their learning process. It's adapting the task sometimes, and help with the social relation. And she was giving an anecdote which shows how sometimes not knowing or the need for a professional. So a young worker with autistic worker, his manager wanted to fire him because he said, well, he's not productive. He talks constantly. And the job coach was very curious about that, because it did not fit the person that she met. So she went and observed him, and what she saw was that his co-workers wanted to say hello and wanted to be nice. So every time they passed by, they came and started talking to him. And what he learned to be polite was to stop, look at the person, and try to engage in a conversation. So a lot of people came by, and he stopped a lot during his day. So here was the answer was to say to everyone, well, don't come and disturb him when he's working, and as well teaching him that just nodding might be enough, or being able to say, well, I can talk right now, I'm trying to focus. So everyone was meant well. So the individual wanted to be polite, the co-workers wanted to be nice, but the outcome was bad for the individual, and he was at risk of losing his job. So having this support to translate and understand those social situations was really helpful. Ça va?
Oui.
So finally, I think it's important when you think about work and disability to see that workplace interaction come as well into an ecosystemic approach. So you need to have a lot of parts working. So individuals with disabilities are included in the labor market. So of course, family and relative can give support. You need to have employment support services that are competent and well-financed. So the job coaches that we just talked about. But you need as well accessible education. We know that individual with disability having more education or more in employment than individual with disability that have low level of education. So access to education is very important. You need as well different provision in the community. So is there accessible housing? If you have unstable housing, it's difficult to participate in the labor market. Are transportation available and accessible? Health and social services is very important. If you have chronic pain and you need 4 months before getting an appointment to get new medication, you might have to stop working, and it's hard after that to go back into the job market. So having health and social services that are there when needed. If you need to wait 18 months before meeting a psychologist, a therapist, then again, it might be a long time outside of employment. As well, income support programs are important. So income support program, are they very rigid, and they consider that you're either disabled or not disabled? So, or can you come and go in those programs with the change in your situation when you're thinking about the episodic disability? So you might have moments where you are impaired. So can you get income support or provision during that time? And then when you can go back to work, then it stops, and you can, there's a flexibility on that. So all this depend on societal values and the public policy that we do to make sure that individuals with disability can be included in our workplaces. Well, if we want to look at what's needed as future research, of course, bias and discrimination, we know that people don't consider the different disability the same way, and because they have different judgment regarding the type of disability, they might act differently in the workplace. Language, maybe Solène, that's your PhD. Can you say a little bit about what is it?
Oui, ben en fait, c'est l'importance que les mots utilisés viennent des individus en tant que tels et non pas d'une espèce d'élite qui poserait le diagnostic et les mots à dire. Donc, je donne l'exemple de l'autisme. Généralement, on va parler du trouble du spectre de l'autisme quand ça vient de la recherche, quand ça vient des professionnels et des intervenants. Alors que si on parle de la communauté en tant que telle, la communauté va préférer autisme et un langage plus centré sur l'individu et sur l'identité et non pas sur la personne. Donc, il y a toute cette notion de langage et de termes à utiliser, de vocabulaire, de lexique qu'il faut utiliser pour parler vraiment au nom des bonnes personnes.
That's a tough one to translate. So I would say how to adjust language. So is the language decided by a medical elite or a researcher elite, or do the people have the right to define the language that is used to define themselves and being able to portray themselves as they see themselves? Is it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So my own interest is how to better integrate universal accessibility into the workplace to reduce the need for future accommodation. And how can we put that in more concrete terms with organization? The role of union needs to be researched. So I know in Quebec, there's a committee, a governmental committee that looks into that recently because sometimes they're not really targeted in effort to do awareness about disability and the accommodation process, and they're asked to accompany people, but they don't have many tools to do that. We need as well to see how to support more first-line supervisors that are the ones that need to enact the accommodation. So are they supported in that role by their organization, or is this taking into account where their own performance is judged into the organization? Very little has been done regarding performance evaluation, compensation, and career development. We know about discrimination, but we don't know how can we do a fair performance evaluation for someone that could be super performant in one or two tasks, but maybe not very polyvalent. So they might be very good in one or two tasks, but have difficulties or one or two tasks, or we accommodate them so they don't do X and Y duties. So what kind of performance evaluation, what are the criteria to do performance evaluation in those situations, and what's the impact on compensation? And finally, how can we help individuals with disability to improve their being able to do self-advocacy, to know their rights, to be able to improve the way they can negotiate accommodation, knowing the different factors that it can affect. So main takeaways would be adults with disabilities are not a marginal group. So when we think about our workplaces and our aging workplaces, we need to think about disability and ways to make accommodation, adaptation much more present in our workplaces. Those accommodations are either physical or social, and they're really important to allow workers with disability to remain in employment. And collaboration of all stakeholders is needed to move towards a universally accessible workplaces. So organization, public policies, unions, and I would say the medical and social service and health services as well all have a place, an important place to accessibility in workplace. And finally, autistic individuals are an untapped pool of potential workers. You have a lot of bias, you have a lot of restriction to access, and it's important to look at those and to be able to use this pool of workers that wants to work. I think I'm done here.
Thank you. Wow, that was an amazingly interesting presentation, and really thank you, Valérie and Solène, for this very interesting presentation from different point of view, from an academic point of view, analytical, from a practitioner point of view, as well as from someone who experienced this firsthand. So in these last moments of our webinar, I would ask if you have any question to please type your question in the chat box. You can type to everyone if you prefer, or otherwise you can target directly Valérie or Solène. And as the question will come in, they will try to answer maybe one or two questions together. Maybe they are very similar. I received just while people are typing their question, I received a couple of questions about
stop sharing.
yeah, about if the presentation will be available after this meeting.
Yeah, of course.
Webinar. So everything will be available in two ways. You can address directly if you want, Valérie or Solène, if you have any further and specific question. But as per all the other webinars by the Canadian Industrial Relations Association, we record them. So we are recorded right now, as you can see, and we will post on our YouTube channel. So if you just Google CIRA ACRI on a YouTube channel, you will find a very large number of seminars we had on several different topics relating to work and employment. And more specifically, in the last 2-3 webinars we had that were targeting equality, diversity, and inclusion topics. Valérie and Solène, if you received any question, if you want to start to answer, or
I see one question. So do organization provide disability and inclusion training or awareness sessions? So they are, I'm more familiar with the Quebec ones. I try in my slide to show different Canadian organizations. So sometimes they're specialized with type of disability. So there is the organization that is called Ready, Willing, and Available.
Yeah.
Ready, Willing, and Able, that targets more workers, discuss more about workers with intellectual disability or worker with autism, and they try to go to businesses to try to raise awareness and interest in improving the flexibility of their workspace and raising awareness about this pool of workers.
Yeah, and they are working with Inclusion Canada, who's doing similar things.
Yeah, you're doing works with Inclusion Canada.
Yeah.
I don't know if we can say that, or it's
we have a podcast
coming on.
Yeah.
So there are a couple across Canada. In Quebec, I've worked with the CRISPECH, so the Centre de recherche pour l'inclusion des personnes en situation de handicap. They are regular webinars they give. The Comité consultatif des personnes handicapées as well gives a regular webinar.
Yeah. And I do this work as well.
Yeah. So Solène does presentation, and you're getting used to doing it in English, but you often do a presentation in French, and you have a wonderful podcast that's called Les neurodivergents.
Yeah, it's finished, but
well, 50 episodes. So if you want to know more about the working life and neurodivergent condition, this is a wonderful podcast that's very funny. And by 3 professionals in HR. So it's very interesting.
And 3 neurodivergent people.
Exactly. Another question is, does the type of industry matters? Probably yes, I would say. Some industry might be more open-minded. In some industry, I guess accommodation are easier to negotiate and implement. Another might take more investment. I don't know if you have any idea about that, Solène.
Yeah, it depends because well, it's a matter of c'est une mode. C'est une mode. C'est une mode. Donc, yeah, it's a fashion. So they influence each other to have this awareness. But yeah, it begins.
Yeah, I think one idea is doing a training or webinar is one thing, going to every policy one after one and trying to see what are the biases in there and how can we change it. That's
oops.
We lost, Valérie, we lost your mic.
Am I back?
Yes.
Yeah,
sorry, I just pushed on that button by mistake.
There was a second
Yeah,
aspect
so
in terms of future research? What matters about methodology for future research about disability inclusion in workplace?
I think there is place for every type of methodology right now. So either quantitative based on survey, either qualitative and trying to explore and unpack the process. Comparing the study that I cited, comparing people with disability and without disability and getting work accommodation is really as well interesting. So a lot can be done, and I invite this person to contact me directly if you want to have a discussion about that. I would be very pleased to discuss about this.
Mm-hmm. On a parlé de professionnels en neuro-inclusion ou job coach. C'était possible d'avoir plus de précision sur ces professionnels. Au Québec, c'est beaucoup les services d'employabilité de la main-d'œuvre, les fameux CEMO, qui vont s'occuper de ce volet-là. Donc, c'est des professionnels payés par le gouvernement, donc gratuits pour l'individu et pour l'entreprise, qui vont aller en entreprise ou auprès de l'individu puis l'accompagner. Donc, c'est individuel. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne va pas intervenir auprès d'une entreprise at large. Il faut que vraiment, on va suivre l'individu dans son emploi, puis c'est auprès de son emploi qu'on va agir. Mais ces individus-là, ces personnes-là sont vraiment des personnes magiques là, qui vont... Non, c'est vrai! Moi, par exemple, ils m'ont aidé pour mon entrevue, donc m'ont aidé à analyser comment ça se faisait que j'étais épuisée à chacune de mes entrevues, puis que ça ne fonctionnait pas. Donc, on s'est rendu compte que j'étais trop attentive à ce qui se passait autour de moi, donc on a travaillé là-dessus. Ils vont aider dans les demandes d'accommodements aussi, par exemple, ou mettre en contact avec près disponible et capable, notamment c'est avec eux qu'on va passer. Donc, je ne sais pas si ça répondait à la question, mais...
Au Québec, on peut les trouver, ils sont regroupés dans l'organisation qui s'appelle ROSEF.
Oui.
Donc, si vous voulez obtenir mes diapositives, j'ai noté ça dans les ressources. In Canada, I don't know much about how those support organizations are organized. Well, I know the Canadian Association for Supported Employment, I think, would be a good place to start, because I think they group a lot of supported employment organization across Canada. Mm-hmm. So that would be a place I would start to try to locate supported employment organization across Canada.
But it's similar. It's provincial funded, and
I thought there was a distinction between Canadian and other provinces and Quebec in matter of work responsibility, but
it depends.
I still need to learn about that.
We also have another question about the consistently inconsistent issue of some disabilities and how accommodation they work in this case. Effective accommodation, more importantly.
Mm-hmm. I think ADHD might be difficult, of course, because, so it's episodic. So sometimes you're more fatigued, let's say, and it's going to be harder to focus. You're being inattentive, or other time it's less.
You're in a flow.
Yes, and sometimes you're in a flow and it goes very good. Providing accommodation might be first starting with a good fit between the type of job and your own needs. As someone with an ADHD, it might be help to have a realistic deadlines, let's say. It might be as well to provide the right condition to be able to enter in your flow. Sometimes body doubling, I'm not sure if it says in French. So having someone with you helping you start on a task might help you to get to that flow, instead of just you having to start on your own into something and being distracted by a lot of things. So there might be some tricks, and I guess asking the support of a professional might help you to get what is a right fit for your own needs.
Thank you, Valerie. Just if I can, a very quick last question about, I mean, I'm very curious, and I study trade unions, and trade unions, they have this collective vision and this equality vision, not equity. Whereas here there is so our union can think about and kind of resolve the issue between the individual and the collective, and between equality and equity. I know it's a big question, but
It's
just
a big question.
few
Well, the first thing
insights, if you can,
is
please.
the same way employers have an ideal worker idea of who is the normal people to be in this role. I think unions might have as well this ideal workers in mind, and broadening this idea of who are the potential worker in those roles might open up their own view of what is equality. So if we think everyone has exactly the same profile, that inequity will come very easily when you get different needs. But if you have a very broad view of who are your members and who you are negotiating for, then your collective will be much more diverse. And then when you go into negotiating collective agreement, you negotiate for a broader type of needs instead of very narrow needs based on your ideal worker.
Mhm.
I don't know if it answered.
Oh yeah, that's very interesting and fundamental. If there are no other questions, again, thank you very much, Valérie and Solène. This has
Merci.
been an amazing
Excuse
session.
me.
And I will stay to give my email, Mrs. Narin.
Yes,
Narin.
you could-
Yeah,
yes,
for
yes.
sure. So don't
Okay.
worry.
Yeah, you can maybe also put in the chat for everyone. If
Yeah,
you'd
I
like,
will put in
Valérie or
my
Solène.
chat.
It's up to
In the
you.
chat.
Hello.
Yeah, in the chat. And I
Hello?
mean, I would remind you that this webinar has been recorded. Give us a little bit of time, and then it will be uploaded on the CIRA ACRI YouTube channel. And please, if you're interested, you can watch other webinars we had, especially the forthcoming webinars. You can follow our activities on the CIRA ACRI website, and you can find a lot of information, including if you're a professional or searching a job in employment relation. We have a job post over there. You can post or you can read the post. We have our year conference coming up next year in May. Is going to be in Toronto, as well as we have many other activities. If you want any other information about CIRA, you can also contact me directly or any other person. Finally, a big thank to all of you. We have been 80 people at some point connected, and never below, until a few minutes ago, 70. That means that this topic is something that is very interesting, and all different stakeholders have to work on to really reduce inequality for some people who are accessing and working in the labor market. Thank you, Solène, once again. Thank you, Valérie. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice afternoon and a wonderful weekend.